author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Hello and welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. Today's special edition, we are talking personnel is policy, what's happening with Trump and Europe. It's going to be quite the show. Please remember, Liberty Nation Radio is sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Hello and welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. Very fortunate to have with us back in the studio, Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, Mr. Scott Cosenza. How are you, sir?
Delighted to be back in my perch on my position in a segment on the big show, Mark. That's
your time in purgatory is over. We won't expose.
Gee, okay.
No, it's good to have you on. So I guess what I really want to talk about today is the idea that personnel is policy, which is a term that you presented to me a short while ago. And I think it's so fitting because we've got the brand new Trump administration in place with, I believe, all of the major appointments now settled, confirmed, in position. And if people want to know what the next 4 years has in store in terms of what each of these agencies are going to be doing, you need look no further than who Donald Trump has put in charge of them.
Well, there's going to be one part of your statement that I vehemently disagree with. I think it goes right to the heart of things, which is saying that most of the important positions have been decided on and confirmed or implemented, and that is not true. Directly to your point, an agency head may want any number of things, but unless that agency head can rely on deputies to execute their mission, which one presumes is the president's mission for that agency and what's to be done, then we have what we have kind of always had in at least probably my lifetime in Washington, which is the bureaucracy just kind of continues to move along. The pace, by which they do their bidding is maybe accelerated or retarded a bit, but it's slow train coming, regardless. And that's what maybe, I still say, though it looks like a promising start, but we'll have to view this through the lens of history. It may be finally changing now with Donald Trump's second term in office.
Yeah. Okay. Good point. So there's, so for example, there are certain agencies that don't get a specific appointment that goes through Congress for advice and consent, and
most of the appointments, thousands of appointments, are not confirmed by the Senate. They're direct presidential appointments. So, for instance, at the top of any agency that has offices around the country, all the people who are at the tops of those agency offices are generally presidential appointees. But they are not confirmed by the Senate. This is about the getting, once the president settles on the name of the person they think is going to be the right person, they go ahead and put it forward. And as you imagine, they kind of fill from the top down, right? So those things typically take place well after the actual cabinet secretaries and agency heads are installed.
So I think a couple of the more interesting ones that would fit into that category are podcast host Dan Bongino, who is now tasked as the assistant director of the FBI. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
So,
yeah.
What do you make of that?
It's interesting. The thing that I find interesting most of all about it is, and I don't know all of Mr. Bongino's history, he ran for Congress just, I think, one district north of where I am recording this from, in Maryland is where he ran. And I met him on his campaign trail. This is probably a dozen years ago. And he had, even then, a message of limited government, and that was his motivation. I know that, of course, he's a famous podcaster and famously a former member of the U.S. Secret Service, the detail, as they say, the protective detail around the president. So he's got some really insider knowledge and understanding, but also the management of lots of people in and of itself is a skill. So when it's executing policy that the president wants for certain investigatory preferences or impetuses, he may be a great person for that. I'm hoping that he also does a good job of managing. There's the workaday job of a federal police force of thousands of people
Sure.
who are supposed to be not investigating presidents and congresspersons, but investigating the crimes against Americans, whether it's the kind of more pedestrian ripoff scheme for the little old lady over some scam call that costs her thousands, up into and including some massive highfalutin stock swindle, including technical aspects that I can't even understand. That's all federal crime, and it would be great if the federal government actually protected us from those who local police, by the way, cannot do. It's one of the things
Sure.
that the FBI was founded to do, was prosecute crimes that are ill-suited towards criminal prosecution, state and locally.
Yes, I think that really comes back to the idea that personnel is policy, because it seems highly unlikely after the massively contentious last 4 years where Donald Trump was dragged through every court imaginable for crimes real and imagined.
They just applied the law to the facts, Mark.
Yeah,
that was sarcasm.
Of course.
I guess,
Naturally, they applied the law, the new law that
Yeah.
they made up to fit.
Let's just take a moment to remind everyone that when Donald Trump was prosecuted, the Justice Department used new interpretations of previously existing federal law, which had never been applied in those manners, and then proclaimed it was like a pedestrian-like prosecution of just applying the law to the facts. And I said it because it's fantastic and no one believes it who has an understanding
Sure.
of how they've ever operated and then decided to newly operate against Donald Trump. So what would be great for the Trump administration FBI, by the way, and I know you didn't ask me, I'm going to answer it anyway,
You go
though,
for it.
if they
In fact, I'll go and have a coffee. You carry on asking and answering the
Well,
questions, and I'll see you at the end of the show.
If they turn the clock back from all of that entrepreneurial, let's get involved in more and more things that weren't included in our grant of authority and our purview, and return to, I asked people at the time Donald Trump was picking his making his choices for the top of justice. If I asked many people this question, which was, if you thought you were the victim of a federal crime, for instance, we had an instance where one of Liberty Nation website properties was hacked. We didn't even call the police or the FBI to report this crime. And the reason why is because literally, I would imagine they would just laugh us out. Like there would be nobody taking a report. Nobody would actually care. Not that it was the crime of the century, but that's my expectation as the victim of federal crime, to have literally zero information paid to it. Meanwhile, some election issue that might benefit the establishment and punish anti-establishment forces, you might expect them to be all over it.
Very much so, which is why I think Kash Patel's made it rather clear, the new director of the FBI, that he intends to get back to the basics of crime fighting, which I don't see how that can be a bad thing, because it almost seems ludicrous to assume that what we've seen for the last 4 years was just protecting everyday people. It was pursuing prosecution for something that wasn't pertinent at that time, other than the fact that it would potentially stymie Donald Trump's re-election. It's something that could have been outsourced. I'm not sure to whom, but it could have been outsourced, but not drawing the very, very specific resources that were in place at that time. And I think that kind of attitude towards get back to crime fighting has got to be very comforting to Americans who have witnessed quite a lot of lawlessness. Now, speaking of lawlessness, we'll be back with Scott Cosenza.
And I want to talk about Kash Patel when we come back.
Kash Patel and the ATF. This is going to be fun. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio. I remain your host, Mark Angelides, and we continue to be joined by Scott Cosenza. So, Scott, in the first part here, we were just talking about Kash Patel, Dan Bongino. Let's get your thoughts on what Kash Patel has laid out in terms of what he's going to do over the next 4 years.
Well, the Kash Patel nomination and confirmation is truly remarkable, Mark. The idea that a head of the FBI would have a significant, almost a decade of experience as a public defender is kind of earth-shattering for those of us who've charted the recent, the history of the FBI, which has been so pro-prosecution. It's hard to really quantify. It's 100% prosecution minded, and the idea that justice includes, a defense that is respected in a way that's not denigrated, is really new. It's the kind of thing where, neither Barack Hussein Obama, who was supposed to be a liberal's idea of a good president, or Bill Clinton, none of those, like
William
Reno,
Jefferson Clinton.
Yeah, William Jefferson Blythe Clinton, actually.
There you go.
The hypocrisy knows no bounds, because they made fun of George Herbert Walker Bush for having many names, but William Jefferson Blythe Clinton was so they couldn't even win that. It's just one of those things where, it's fun to remember the hypocrisy, isn't anew with
Sure.
response to the Trump administration.
John Trump
just turned up more. Yeah. But it's a real win for liberals. It's a win for limited government. Let's remember the government is in place to protect us from each other, and then limited to protect us from it. The scary part is the government coming after us inappropriately, and that it went after Donald Trump, and he prevailed. And we now have people like Tulsi Gabbard, who was the victim survivor of illegal government prosecution and law enforcement action, motivated not with a genuine effort to protect Americans, but in service of restricting her free speech or punishing her for it. This kind of impetus, and to see Kash Patel, who served, by the way, not in a white shoe kind of upper level white collar criminal defense, but public defender, Miami-Dade County, both state and federal. These are abattoirs of justice, Mark, not high level dealings where the real dirty work that a lot of prosecutors engage in, I'm sure, was revealed to Mr. Patel, which I think just elevates him in terms of when he's looking out for Americans. It's not just prosecution win. It's let's selectively use our resources to get the people who are hurting others. We shouldn't
triaging justice, as it were.
There are so few federal criminal prosecutorial resources that we can direct them all at crimes and people whom we all would agree should be prosecuted, the fraudsters and the violent people. We don't have to go for those maybe cases of, should we use a new interpretation of the law, to go after somebody who also happens to be our political rival? That kind of thing need not happen.
I believe the last I've seen of the FBI was watching White Collar about a decade ago, and there's no Neil Caffrey on the books nowadays. So let's move from, let's stick with Kash Patel, but away from the FBI and to the ATF, or the BATF, I think. BATFE. Oh,
if
yeah.
You really want to say it, it's the Bureau
yeah.
of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives.
The BATFA. Yeah.
The ATF guys, just like they want to be in the cool three-letter CIA, FBI, but they never have been. They've always been far lesser than in terms of their purview and their respect amongst law enforcement and what they've been able to accomplish. But it makes no sense that, for instance, our nation's premier executive protection agency is the Secret Service, which is in the Department of Treasury. And those Treasury agents, you may not know this, but the ones that are on the presidential detail, they actually have caseloads or other executive detail protection details. They actually have caseloads pursuant to like counterfeiting and like random Treasury investigations. It's kind of preposterous to have them. It was just an accident of history. And then, once they have it's in their turf, it's like you could never move it because, there's a lot of people with vested interest in keeping things where they are. And so it would just make sense to reimagine all this, have a federal police force. You could call it any number of things. And federal law enforcement would then be, you could have a gun crime unit and you could have a counterfeiting unit. And maybe because of the unique nature of how Treasury notes are, it's a highly specified, right, to really tell how to make one and counterfeit one. Okay, fine. It would make sense to have some expertise there. But the federal crime force should just be a federal police force, divided amongst people. And Kash Patel, I think, is going to do that. I think the appointment of him to be an interim leader of the ATF is about extinguishing the separate agency, would be my guess.
So presumably because he is director of the FBI, he doesn't need a further appointment to become interim boss over at ATF, right?
There is no crime that an ATF agent can lodge a charge for, bring a charge for a U.S. attorney that an FBI agent cannot do the same thing for. It may not work in the reverse. The ATF, through their rules and regulations, may only be able to bring crimes under certain sections of the federal code that pertain to gun crime, but that's not true for FBI agents. So there's just no reason to
cigarette crime, presumably, and alcohol.
Yeah. Right. Yes. Well, actually, you make a point there. Okay, so that's part of the accident of history as to how this happened. And how it happened is the fiction is so many things that we have going on are based on these fictions. The fiction is that they're after a tax violation.
Sure.
That it is a tax crime, which is how Prohibition, by the way, Treasury agents were the lead officers against alcohol in Prohibition because it was a violation. The federal tax stamp wasn't paid. They tried to enforce marijuana laws in the same way. In fact, in state laws, they did that. Some states where marijuana was illegal passed a state tax requirement that your marijuana had to be accompanied by a tax stamp, and of course, no one ever did it.
That's a brave marijuana girl.
Here's what it allowed them to do. Anytime anybody was found possessing marijuana, they also got an additional state tax crime added onto it, which was, of course, disingenuous and designed only to punish people, not to actually collect a tax. So it's through that accident of history that the ATF is who are Treasury agents, by the way. Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives are Treasury agents under the Treasury Department. And that's how they got that purview, because guns were taxed federally. And so you didn't pay a tax stamp on a machine gun. And that's why the ATF became the people who enforce those laws.
So they've managed to really build up a poor reputation over the last 20 years, the ATF. I know, understatement of the year, or the decade, perhaps.
Waco was 94 or 5. It's
90. Oh, that's 30 years. 30 years. So do you think
not that they didn't smear themselves before that?
Of course,
Randy Weaver was before Waco, I think, and a few others.
So do you think that a restructuring would be, I don't know what's the best way to say it, to kind of wipe away the stain that covers the agency and rebuild it anew, or is it just going to be sidelined until government changes hands again?
I think that the ATF so poisoned the well with how they behaved at Waco, and their reputation amongst law-abiding, good people, gun owners, is of a toxic, overbearing body that wishes to not uphold the law, but punish Americans for their interest in the gun culture. So I think extinguishment is the best course ahead for them.
Well, we'll see what happens once Kash Patel really gets his teeth into the matter. Scott Cosenta, thanks ever so much for being here.
Thank you.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I remain your host, Mark Angelides. Now, we're joined by Liberty Nation's national security correspondent, expert on all things defense and Pentagon, Mr. Dave Patterson. Thanks for joining us again, Dave.
Thank you, Mark. Happy to be with you.
So, Dave, it's really, this is your season, as it were. Sometimes there's apple picking season. Sometimes there's lobster catching season. This is the national security season, I think, that we're currently enjoying. And one war does not a global conflict make, but this particular one seems to have created I'm talking obviously Russia and Ukraine. It seems to have created ripples in the, what would you call it? The globalist pool, as it were, because we have everybody seemingly united on the goal of, well, we need to stop the war and we need to stop people dying. But the approaches towards this have divided Europe from America. What's your take?
Well, I think first and foremost is that what united the U.S. and Europe was this notion that we will continue to provide military and financial and humanitarian support to Ukraine for, quote, as long as it takes. But what they don't say, or as much as it takes. And that was the downfall of the entire approach to Ukraine, because quite frankly, Mark, the Americans do not have a long attention span for that kind of strategy, if indeed you could call it a strategy. But I think that was the whole idea, that we continue to put stuff in the Ukraine so we don't have to put people in the Ukraine. And that was what it was all about. And so enter Donald Trump, and he is not about that at all. He's about getting it over. He's a transactional individual. He wants it over. He continues to talk about, the death and destruction and how it's just so horrible. And it is. And what was happening is that the European Union led, or the accomplice to the U.S. was just protracting this. And he was not going to have anything like that happen under his watch.
So, to play as somewhat devil's advocate here with you, Dave, you say the American public doesn't have an appetite for a protracted engagement of any description. But of course, Afghanistan went on for 20 years, thereabouts. And that was not just time and treasure, that was time, treasure, and blood. But I think that a lesson, and actually this isn't playing devil's advocate, I'm agreeing with you. Sorry, okay, rephrasing this. That I think there's only a certain amount, I don't think anybody in America now would be really willing to put boots on the ground, whether that's to help Ukraine win or to act as a peacekeeping force after the conflict is ended. But I also think that there isn't the appetite for the continued sending of treasure, because that treasure and that focus and attention could be better spent elsewhere. And if it's not being spent elsewhere, then it's always finite. So you're weaker in one area because you're bolstering something over here. And I get that Russia presents a global threat to some extent, but this really isn't America's problem. And yet America became, under Joe Biden, the figurehead for the fight against Russia, but in such a piecemeal manner that it's almost as though it were just President Joe Biden wanting to look like a wartime consigliere, as it were, but he wasn't. He just wanted the clothes that came with being a wartime president.
No,
I hope I got this wrong.
But I think that it's even. I think it's even more. It was more insidious and more actually devastating to the U.S. Culture and psyche as to what they were actually doing. And you'll notice that never one time in the 3 years did Biden or Austin or Blinken or Sullivan ever come out and say, this is the U.S. strategy for dealing with Russia and moving them out of Ukraine. No, not one time, because they didn't have a strategy. All they had was a tactic of continually, basically mollifying Ukraine with stuff.
Yeah, that can really only go for so long, because at some point you start running out of people. And to me, I mean, that actually brings us on to a broader question, right? Vladimir Zelensky, President Zelensky's been, I wouldn't say he's been cut out of negotiations. I think that's an unfair way of looking at it, because, there has to be, I think you wrote about this actually on the page of libertynation.com. That's probably where I got the idea, is that Donald Trump and the US government particularly can't be an active partner in helping negotiate a peace between the two countries, Russia, Ukraine, unless there's a relationship unless there's some kind of relational development between the US and Russia and the US and Ukraine. And currently, because of, I guess, 4 years of the Biden administration, there is no relationship with Russia. So until there's a relationship, then the US can't act as a broker in between. I'm pretty sure I got that from you. I don't think.
Well, no, that's right. I mean, the reason that you wouldn't bring Ukraine to your first meeting is the Ukraine would come, Zelensky would come with an agenda. He wants reparations and to have Russia give the land back. Okay. So how is that going to square with the U.S. just trying to build confidence with Russia in that they are there, the U.S. is actually there as a partner to help? Well, here's Ukraine, and they've already put the stake in the ground before the U.S. can even develop, these confidence-building measures, trust. And so you have to do the trust first before you can ever start to look at the eaches.
Yeah, I think that's probably where they are on that. Now, whether Russia, Vladimir Putin, his lot in the KGB, FSB, now, whether they're willing to buy what Donald Trump's selling in terms of he can negotiate an equitable settlement for everybody. I think maybe Russia's a little too distrustful for that.
But they may be in need because their economy is not as robust as it might have been otherwise. And not only that, but there is this, this big hammer that the United States does have, and that is we can cut off all of the liquid natural gas that not by blowing up a pipeline, but taking away the market.
Yeah.
And provide Europe with as much LNG as they need and can use, because we have that much capability. And I think that's where Donald Trump is talking about self-sufficiency and energy sufficient and so forth, because he needs to have that hammer in order to do these deals. And it is a big hammer.
Speak softly and carry a big stick. Now, we're going to talk about who has been upset by Donald Trump's approach to this. And I think it's a fascinating window into the globalist mindset. And we're going to talk about that when we get back after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril. Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Welcome back. We're continuing our conversation with Liberty Nation's national security correspondent, Dave Patterson. Now, Dave, I want to talk about how Europe is trying to deal with a newly empowered Donald Trump when it comes to negotiating the end to the Russia-Ukraine war. And it seems that Europe is trying to follow in some ways. I think it was Winston Churchill who said, when we choose between the ocean and mainland Europe, we must always head towards the ocean when making that choice. And I think that's kind of applicable to what's happening in Europe at the moment. They're saying, well, should we continue following the US lead, or should we carve our own path out? Which is quite ironic, seeing as almost all major decisions are made by the European Union for the nation states, the 26, I think it is, countries within the European Union. But in this regard, that they seem to be looking at casting their own path. And then, of course, this week we've seen French President Emmanuel Macron turn up at the White House. And what's your take on what was said during that bilateral meeting?
Well, I thought the meeting was cordial, and I think that there was this sense that both of these world leaders really do like each other and are very comfortable talking about really kind of sticky things, and aren't particularly embarrassed about their positions. And I thought that it was clear from particularly the exchanges that took place when they were in the Oval Office and had the press conference there. I thought that was it was far more cordial than I had anticipated. That there didn't seem to be this strain that can be there oftentimes. And I thought also that President Trump was more of what he really is in these kinds of situations than the way the media portrays him. And I think that's a good thing. He actually wants to get to an objective in the conversations. He's very transactional, as you know. I mean, and so he is always going for an end state, which is very refreshing.
It is. I'm going to play you a short clip, Dave, and I'd like you to come back and let me know what you think of that.
I'm also pleased that President Macron agrees that the cost and burden of securing the peace must be borne by the nations of Europe, not alone by the United States. And Europe must take that central role in assuring long-term security of Ukraine, which they want to do. And that's not a very big step. The big step is what's going to happen over the next few weeks.
Okay, so as you can see, that was really the bottom line up to the conversation, that Europe needs to bear more of the responsibility, the burden sharing of their own defense. Interestingly enough, almost coincidentally, President Zelensky from Ukraine offered up a proposal that there should be a Ukraine EU armed forces that would be part of a Europe security force and capability. And it sort of is starting to look like a European peacekeeping force within Ukraine, which is kind of what's on the table. So you're seeing this kind of evolutionary, as opposed to sudden, evolutionary approach to how to deal with Russia, but still you have to deal with Russia, and that's not going to happen until there is, as we've discussed, a certain amount of trust on both sides.
There's long been this idea, and this was something that was front and center during the Brexit debate, about the EU wants its own army under its multi-starred flag with its anthem, answerable to the European Union Parliament. And people like Nigel Farage were told that it's a dangerous fantasy that such a thing would come to fruition. However, as we know, there already were certain elements of this in place. And it seems to me that the European Union will be massively pushing for a European coalition army that can draw troops from the member states, and then they can control it and put it on the ground. And whether that's just for a peacekeeping operation or for other things, because there's bound to be other things coming up. They're like, well, we need to send a small contingent over here to do this. And it will be, I fear that what we're witnessing is the start of essentially some kind of European empire. And maybe that's a little hyperbolic, but it's got a flag, it's got an anthem, it's about to get its own army under control, from which can draw troops from the member states, or satraps, if you want to go Persian, on this. But I don't think that's necessarily a good thing, to have a European army, whether it's in service of doing something good or not.
Well, I think, Mark, you also have to realize that there's a certain amount of gravity and mass that is associated with the current United States forces in Europe. I mean, Germany alone, we have 38,700 forces. In Europe, we have as many as 6 sites for our tactical nuclear weapons storage. And places like, Greenland, we've got 100 people who belong to the U.S. Space Force. And so there's a certain amount of presence that the United States has that will be difficult to dislodge, even if even if the United States wanted to. And so I think that is something that the Europeans are going to have to contend with as well. Yeah, and because, there's just a certain amount of value to presence, and that's what the United States has. Now, there are opportunities to do something different. Start to move forces from Europe to where the United States believes it has more of a problem, and that's in the Indo-Pacific, and that's an option. But you always have this, okay, where are you going to billet your forces? And it's clear that, and studies have been done, that bringing them back to the United States is a fairly expensive endeavor.
Yeah, I believe there's a bit of ground around Eagle Pass that could handle a few warm bodies, as it were. So we have this situation where Europe, I say Europe, I mean Europe and the European Union together in this particular setting, is becoming more focused inwards for what it needs to do to combat the Russian aggression. And they seem to be cutting America out because they don't like Donald Trump's strategy. But it has been the European strategy that has been dominant for the last 3 years. And the war is no closer to ending by following that strategy. And then Trump comes in with his new strategy, and they're blocking themselves off and going turtle, I think is the phrase, for their original strategy that has been that is so far 3 years down the line proven not to have made any difference whatsoever. Dave, final word for you. Whose strategy do you think will prevail ultimately?
I think Donald Trump's strategy. I think Donald Trump's approach. The Trump strategy is more of a Trump doctrine that has to that takes in much more than just Europe. And so when you talk about the United States, you have to talk about the larger picture, and that was very well laid out by Hegseth when he was in NATO. First and foremost, the domestic problems at the border, that needs to be solved. Indo-Pacific and China next, and then Europe. And I would offer that the United States has much more in terms of its outreach to our southern neighbors than we've had in the past, and that's important. So it's really a global doctrine that Trump is putting forward, and I think that's what you have to look at when you can't just look at individual Europe versus Indo-Pacific versus our border. You have to look at the whole thing.
So won't people worry that that's creeping elements of globalism, or do they not mind because it would be America at the head of that? Is it?
No, globalism is when you're happy to suborn your country's interests to those of the greater group. That is not what's happening with Trump. We have to look at these things because the United States lives in the world, but not of it. And we do have issues that must be resolved, that must be addressed. But that doesn't mean that we're going to suborn the interests of the United States to any of those regions.
Dave Patterson, thanks ever so much.
Happy to be with you, Mark, always.
And that's all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to thank our guests today, Scott Cosenza and Dave Patterson. Thank you for joining us. And of course, thanks to you, the listeners at home, for taking the time each week to tune in. You are appreciated. Please do remember, Liberty Nation does not endorse candidates, campaigns, or legislation. And this presentation is no endorsement. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.